Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about Wing Chun, but we're going to talk about Wing Chun in the context of writing better social history of the Chinese martial arts. So, why should scholars be concerned with the history of the Asian martial arts? Scholars in general, not just martial arts studies people. And why is it that social history, meaning the attempt to understand the practices of ordinary people set against a wide variety of different variables, why is that particularly useful? To talk about that in this paper, I am going to address a book that I recently wrote with John Nielsen, The Creation of Wing Chun, A Social History of the Southern Chinese Martial Arts. But before I can really delve into it, I want to begin by telling you two stories. The first is a very well-known legend at this point in the traditional Chinese martial arts community. As a matter of fact, I expect that there are many people in this room who could tell this story just as well as I do. It's the creation legend of the Wing Chun system, but a little bit of background may be in order. One of those gentlemen, the older one, Ip Man, who was born in 1893, he died in 1972. He is probably the most well-known master of Wing Chun. He became a prominent figure in the Chinese hand combat community only after he fled from his hometown of Foshan in Guangdong province to Hong Kong in 1949, just ahead of the communist advance. And once in Hong Kong, economic circumstances forced him to do something that he really hadn't done very much of before, which was to teach Wing Chun for a living. Now, his art, Wing Chun, had really been a very small local practice up to that point, and he kind of transformed it into something a little bit more regional by taking it to Hong Kong. And then his best-known student, Bruce Lee, the guy who he's doing Chisa with, obviously, the American actor and martial artist, further transformed Wing Chun into a global phenomenon. Okay? So that's where our first story will come from. Our second story, however, will come from the pages of the July 13th, 1872 edition of a now forgotten newspaper called the North China Herald. Published in English in Shanghai, at the time, this was the most popular newspaper in China for the expatriate community. It was read in Shanghai, but it was also very popular with expatriates living all throughout southern China. And I have never heard this particular account discussed in any account of the Chinese martial arts before. So I believe it will be new to everybody in this room. So we'll have two stories. In some respects, these stories are going to be very different. But if you think about them, you'll see that they share certain concerns and themes. Okay? Taken as a set, I think that they illustrate nicely the challenges that we face when we attempt to write a social history of the Chinese martial arts. So before we talk about writing history, let's begin by trying to imagine two very different visions of what the Southern Chinese martial arts may or may never actually have been. And again, the first of these is going to come directly from the brush of Ip Man. So, the founding of the Wing Chun system. The founder of Wing Chun Kung Fu, Miss Yim Wing Chun, was a native of Canton, China. As a young girl, she was intelligent, athletic, upstanding, and manly, which is an interesting trait in a young girl. She was betrothed to Long Bok Cho, a salt merchant from Fujian. Soon after that, her mother died. Her father, Yim Yi, was wrongfully accused of a crime and nearly went to jail. So the family moved far, far away and settled down at the foot of Tai Lung Mountain on the Yunnan-Sichuan border. There they earned a living selling tofu. All of this happened during the reign of Emperor Kangxi. At that time, Kung Fu became very powerful at the Shaolin Monastery in Henan province. This aroused the fear of the Manchu government, and they sent troops to attack the monastery. They were unsuccessful. A man called Chan Man Wai was the first place graduate to the civil service exam that year. He was seeking favor with the government, and so he proposed a plan. He plotted with the Shaolin monk Ma Ningyi and others. They set fire to the monastery from the inside while the Manchurians attacked from the outside. Shaolin was burned down, the monks were butchered. The Buddhist abbess Ningmoy, the abbot Qi Xin, the abbot Pak Mei, master Fong Fong Totok, and Master Mui Hin all managed to escape. Ning Moi took refuge at White Crane Temple on Mount Tai Lung. There, she came to know the Yim family, and she bought tofu from them. She became their friends. Wing Chun was now a young woman, and her beauty attracted the attention of a local bully. He tried to force Wing Chun to marry her, and this caused a great deal of worry to her and her parents. When Ning Moi learned about this, she took pity on the family, and she came up with a plan. She decided that she was going to teach Wing Chun fighting techniques so that she could solve her problem with the bully herself, and then she could go and she could marry her betrothed husband, Long Bok Cho. So Wing Chun follows Ning Moi up to the mountain, and they travel, open kung fu training montage. They travel and they train, and they travel and they train. And eventually she's able to come back, and she fights the local bully, and she beats him, right? At that point, Ning Moi sets off to travel around the country, but before she leaves, she tells Wing Chun to honor her kung fu traditions, to keep practicing kung fu after she marries, and to help the people overthrow the Qing government and to restore the Ming dynasty. This is how Wing Chun comes to be handed down from the abbess Ning Moi. Now, actually, we'll just keep this up for a while. That's actually not the end of the story, but at this point, the Wing Chun creation myth becomes more kind of the standard lineage genealogy that anyone that is familiar with the Chinese martial arts will know. It talks about how this practice is then passed on to some Cantonese opera performers, and from there it goes to a pharmacist in Foshan called Lung Jan. He teaches his student Chan Hua Shun, and from there it goes right down to Ip Man. This is an interesting story. One of the things that's immediately interesting about it is it's almost impossible to date. It's very, very difficult to date. The version I just read you was written down by Ip Man in the Hong Kong period of his career in anticipation of a group called, the creation of a group called the Wing Chun Tong Fellowship. And for whatever reason, that group never came about. And this story was actually found in his notes after he died. His children found this story when they were going through his papers. The popularity of stories similar to this would suggest that this was something that was in general circulation probably by the 1930s. Okay, so Ip Man probably didn't create it himself. As John Nielsen and I argue in our book, however, this is not probably a very old story. We doubt that this is any older than 1930. Why? Well, that figure, Ning Moi, that we just spent all the time reading about, yeah, in the original versions of the Shaolin myth, she burns down the temple. She's a bad guy, right? She's not a heroine. She's not reimagined as a heroine until a group of kung fu novels are published in the 1930s. So probably this version of the Wing Chun legend comes after that because it seems to be literarily dependent on things from these novels. However, leaving aside specific arguments about the dating of that myth or the dating of the Wing Chun system, I really like this story. I like this story because it paints such a vivid picture of what the world of Southern Kung Fu would have been like in the 18th or 19th centuries, right? Consider some of the major themes that the author of this story wants us to think about. First, we see Kung Fu, we see the martial arts occupying a lawless environment in which the state is kind of powerless to enforce any kind of social order. But the situation is anarchic, as political scientists use that term, rather than being purely chaotic. Okay, it's lawless, but there's a certain code of conduct that channels the expression of violence in the community, right? We see this in that challenge fight between Wing Chun and the local marketplace bully. Notice we don't get a resort to private warfare, right? Yim Wing Chun doesn't figure out where the bully lives, puts a wheelbarrow full of concrete in front of his door and sets the house on fire. And that would be a simpler way to solve your problem rather than learning Kung Fu, right? But we don't do that. There are limits to the types of social violence that we see. I also like that there's a hint of romance in this story, wrapped in a large dose of social propriety, right? So we see Yim Wing Chun fighting off this unwanted suitor to preserve the honor of her childhood fiancé, who she's probably never met before. Right? So that kind of melodramatic romance is sort of typical of Southern storytelling. And all of this happens in an undeniably orientalized and romanticized landscape, right? The action starts off when the Yi family flees the kind of gritty reality that everybody knows of the Pearl River Delta, but they head off to this kind of, mystical mountain in the far west of China that literally has mist-covered temples on it and wandering Buddhist recluses, right? It is exactly the sort of, setting that you would expect to find a kung fu movie happening in. And by the time you get to the end of this creation story, the reader or the listener is left with absolutely no doubt about the value and the inherent virtue of the Southern Chinese martial arts. Our second story was published under the very simple title, Chinese Boxing. And it also revolves around a life-defining challenge match. But these events took place in a much more mundane environment, an environment totally devoid of mist-covered temples. But again, listen and you'll see that we're going to echo some of the same themes in our first story. So again, Chinese boxing. If there is one particular rather than another in which we might least expect to find John Chinaman resemble John Bull, it is in the practice of boxing. The meek celestial does get roused occasionally, but he usually declines a hand-to-hand encounter unless impelled by the courage of despair. He is generally credited with a keen appreciation of the advantages of running away as compared with the treat of standing up to be knocked down, and is slow to claim that high privilege the ancients thought worthy to be allowed only to freemen of being beaten to the consistency of a jelly. How then the race must rise in the esteem of foreigners when we mention that the noble art of self-defense and legitimate aggression flourished in China centuries probably before that fancy ever formed a ring in Britain, which has come to be regarded as the home of boxing. Of course, like everything else in China, the science has rather deteriorated than improved with time. Its practice is rough, its laws unsystematized. Its professors of the art, called fist teachers, offer their services to initiate their countrymen into the use of their maules, their fists, and in addition, in throwing out their feet in a dexterous manner. Boxing clubs are kept up in country villages where pugilists meet and contest the honors of the ring. We are not unused to hearing of fatal encounters in the Western ring, where the brutal sport is hedged about with restrictions intended to guard against its most severe consequences. But in China, homicide in such affairs is made more frequent, we think, by the admission of kicking. A case of this sort has just occurred in Tacheng village, about 8 miles due north of Shanghai. In a tea shop where gamblers and boxers are wont to meet, a dispute arose between two men over 18 cash, which is a very small amount of money. Okay? It was arranged to settle the dispute with a fight. After a few rounds, one man succeeded in knocking the other over with a violent kick to the side. The man sprang to his feet, exclaimed, "Ah, well done," and began to advance again on his antagonist, where he stopped, stumbled, and suddenly fell back dead. Consternation fell on those concerned with the matter, and every effort was made to avoid the judicial inquiry. The relatives of the deceased, however, came forward to make the usual capital out of their misfortune. They seized the homicide, the killer, and chained him to the body of the deceased for 2 nights, which had been removed to the upper floor of the tea house. An arrangement for a financial salve to their lacerated feelings was made, in which the people of the neighborhood were forced to pay $150, that's a lot of money in China, the tea house keeper $100, and the dealer of the fatal blow $50. But gambling and drinking had drained the resources of the latter. He was an impoverished rowdy without a single respectable connection in the world. He only had a betrothal tie, The fate of a young woman had been bound to his before either had a will to consult or the wayward tendencies of his character became known. But, glad of an opportunity to break off this engagement, the young lady's friends came forward and they offered to pay the money if he would surrender all claim to his fiancée. The offer thus being accepted, the affair was settled. The sum of a Chinese boxing match being thus: one combatant killed, a tea-house keeper ruined, a neighborhood heavily fined, and a marriage destroyed. Probably such incidents occur with great frequency, but if the parties can settle it among themselves, the magistrates, for their own sake, are happy to have the matter hushed up. Okay? Now, one could write an entire paper analyzing, deconstructing, investigating this one newspaper story. Period accounts of challenge matches and their social aftermath in any language are extremely rare. This is one of the only actual accounts of a challenge match that's contemporaneous that I've ever come across. But leaving the historical aspect of aside, let's again consider some of the themes that we see between our two stories. Unlike the previous legend, this one can be dated with a fair amount of precision. We're talking about something that happened in the summer of 1872 that is then subsequently reported to the English reading public on July the 13th of that year. This is actually significant for students of Wing Chun because it makes this fight, contemporaneous with that period when Lung Jian is training Chan Hua Shun, right? So this is kind of what is going on in the world in which Wing Chun is created. Nevertheless, this description of the 19th century Chinese martial arts lacks a lot of the exotic Orientalism that marks its predecessor. Still, we see some similarities. Again, the martial arts are strongly being associated with marketplaces and with the sorts of ruffians and the sorts of characters that you see in marketplaces. That's a really important clue for historians of the Chinese martial arts to contemplate, to think about. In the first, more romanticized story, the martial arts are seen as a means by which social norms are illuminated and enforced within the community. The second case demonstrates the opposite possibility, as the fight leads only to death, financial ruin, and the dissolution of a marriage. Yet in both cases, the individuals believe that keeping the state out of this is a really good idea. Some thematic differences are also important to consider. Yim Wing Chun and her father are alone in a hostile world, right? This is why we need the intervention of a Shaolin monk, because there's no one else who can help them, right? So you go to a superhero. When we think of the other story, the battle in Tacheng village, what we're reminded of is that no, actually the Chinese martial arts and all kinds of social violence in general usually happened in villages that were dominated by very strong clan structures. Everybody had someone they could turn to. So if you're looking at something the size of Tacheng village, there are probably only going to be 2 or 3 major surnames. So there are going to be a couple of big clans. And this part of the story where we take the guy and chain him to the dead body and hold him hostage until the other clan pays us a ransom, that was actually a very common way of settling intra- and inter-village disputes in the late Qing dynasty and even through the Republic period at this point in time. But I think probably tone is the most important difference to pay attention to between these two stories. Right? The account of Yim Wing Chun emerges from within the Chinese martial arts community. It's what anthropologists would call an emic account of these fighting systems, and it views them as a fundamentally positive means by which people exercise their agency to resolve important disputes in their lives. The second story is what anthropologists would call etic, right? It is written from an outsider's perspective. Moreover, this kind of anonymous it's probably written by the editor of the newspaper, this anonymous reporter, he holds the Chinese martial arts in fairly low regard. He doesn't like Chinese boxing. More than that, I actually cut out large sections of this account to keep it light and manageable. in some of the material I cut out, it's also evident that he doesn't like English boxing either. He thinks English boxing is a bad idea, right? And so you wonder, is he criticizing Chinese boxing as kind of a jab against his Western readers who he thinks are probably fans of this other sport as well? And that's something that's interesting to think about. But this air of disdain that we see throughout the second account is in some ways, that's very authentic. It's very interesting because it reminds us that most individuals in 19th century China were not fans of the martial arts. Even though that was a fairly violent and unstable period, most people found martial artists to be socially marginal. They didn't want anything to do with them. So even once we control for the questions of, kind of the hostile tone, I think the second account really offers some interesting historical and ethnographic detail. All right, so we now have two competing visions of the Southern Chinese martial art. We have a period account of an alleged event that had happened a couple weeks or a couple months prior to that. And then we have a legend, really an example of folk history that purports to reveal the origins of a style that's now becoming regionally popular that's at least 100 years old. And there's a matter of social memory, right? One of these accounts is still remembered today. I guarantee you, in this city, somewhere today, someone will teach the story of Yim Wing Chun, right? It will be enacted right here in Cologne, probably within a couple hours from now. The other account, while maybe more historically accurate, has been totally forgotten. It was a cautionary tale to a community that doesn't exist anymore. So when faced with two such differing accounts, what do we do? Well, the first question that I think we often ask is, in many respects, the least helpful. To paraphrase Paul Bowman from yesterday, this is a terrible question. Students look at these two contrasting accounts, these two different descriptions of the Southern Chinese martial arts, and they ask, which is true, right? Which one of these is a better description of the way the Chinese martial arts really were? And if we think about this for a couple minutes, on some level, the answer's got to be neither of these are actually very good accounts. I mean, the problem with that Wing Chun story is more obvious. To begin with, the Southern Shaolin temple that most martial artists in the South talk about never actually existed. The Northern Shaolin temple that Ip Man specifically references in his version of the story was never burned to the ground by the Qing. I mean, they kept good records on what they burned to the ground, right? And they never butchered the monks. These are, historical facts. They're not really up for dispute. But, there are other issues as well. The female heroines of the Wing Chun legend bear an uncanny resemblance to the female figures that we find in Fujini's White Crane history, right? Which is, again, probably not a coincidence. But our second account, the journalistic account, also has some serious problems. This is not a shining example of investigative journalism, even by 19th century standards. Okay? If you think about it, there are certain key pieces of information that we would want that are missing from this account. Like, what was the exact date that this fight happened on? Or that guy that got killed, what was his name? Right? If you would actually want to go and investigate this, you'd like to know those things. Now, there is a certain level of descriptive detail that leads me to suspect that, yeah, that event probably happened more or less the way that he said it did. And yet, when you read the article a couple of times, what becomes evident is that this was not written to teach foreign language readers anything about Chinese boxing or the sociology of the Chinese martial arts. Rather, this was kind of a transparent attempt on the part of this editor to get his readers to imagine the Chinese people, and by extension, China writ large, in a certain way. This was a construction of ethnic and nationalist mythologies by other means. Right? The correlation between the socioeconomic status of our authors and the way in which they discuss the martial arts is also probably not a coincidence. As one reads various accounts of the martial arts that are published in the Chinese language literature between, I would say probably between about 1870 and 1940, you'll see that there are about three different schools of thought that come up. Now, on the one hand, we have individuals that are just unreservedly in favor of the Chinese martial arts, and they see them as empowering and as a way that people kind of address their weaknesses and solve their problems. Then you get a second group of people who say, yeah, okay, that's true, but it will only work if the Chinese martial arts are seriously reformed. We got to first modernize them and make them scientific, and that means putting them at the disposal of the state. And once we've done that, once we've modernized the martial arts and put them at the disposal of the state, then they'll be okay. Then there's a third group, often led by the May 4th intellectuals, who say, no, the Chinese martial arts are backwards, superstitious, feudal practices. There is no place for them in modern China. And interestingly enough, where you stand on that is often correlated to your socioeconomic status. The more elite you are, the more problematic you tend to view the martial arts as being. And every one of these groups crafts their own stories. They craft their own accounts to back their arguments up. It all seems very much like James C. Scott's description from his classic study, Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Forms of Peasant Resistance. That's kind of what you're seeing in 19th century China as you look at discussions of the martial arts. And in many respects, I think that this sort of debate and these sorts of accounts, this is very representative of what you as a scholar are going to find when you start to do research on the social history of the Chinese martial arts. So when faced with these sorts of contrasting narratives, all of which have been shaped by somebody else's hands, right? What is a social historian to do? Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is we have to stop and we have to think very carefully about some questions in research design. What is the actual goal of our analysis? When I start to write a book about Wing Chun, do I really want to know the year in which, the first Bong Sao was done? Is that the point of a book about Wing Chun? Or is my goal to understand something about the community that developed these techniques and passed them on at different points in time? Good social history produces two things. It produces causal and descriptive inferences. My approach to these questions is a result of my background as a social scientist and John Nielsen's background also in the social sciences. We were both trained in the case study method of theory testing rather than the area studies approach. Both John Nielsen and I decided right at the beginning that we were interested in moving beyond pure description. We did not want to write a purely interpretive exercise. We wanted to develop a framework that could speak directly to a wide variety of sociological theories, not just even the theories we would have, but other people's theories as well, without denying the fruitfulness of what has been called the embodied turn that we have seen in sociology and anthropology in the last couple of decades. We would humbly suggest that students of martial arts studies think very carefully about their linked methodological and theoretical assumptions. The hand combat systems are called martial arts, right? They are arts precisely because they exist only as social institutions. They differ from pure violence in that these techniques are passed down through a framework of ideas and identities that are meant to be conveyed from teacher to student. So the question of community involvement is not superfluous or secondary when we are discussing the history of the martial arts. It is central to the entire enterprise. We are talking about communities when we talk about the martial arts. The author of that 1872 account, whoever he was, I actually have a theory on that, but I'm still working on it, whoever he was, I think correctly identified that most of the individuals who invested themselves in these sorts of fighting systems were socially marginal. And that is not restricted to China during the Qing dynasty or the Republic period. A wide variety of anthropologists and sociologists have found these same associations with marginality in lots of different societies and cultures around the globe. And this is precisely why historians, not just people interested in martial arts, but historians in general, need to pay attention to the social history and the popular culture of the Chinese martial arts, right? In China, as in most places in the world, a relatively small group of educated elites were responsible for writing the histories that we now have. That means it's almost impossible. It is very difficult to reconstruct the day-to-day realities of most people's lives. The Chinese martial arts are interesting in that they offer us a unique window onto the hopes and concerns of a large segment of the population that might otherwise be overlooked. Further, the lineage-based nature of these practices means that they have to look towards history to legitimize themselves. So these fighting systems have often preserved either stories or documents that historians will find very helpful, very useful. Beyond that, members of the local community, who may or may not be martial artists, often associate the martial arts and the Asian fighting systems with important identities from the past that they're trying to preserve. You know, this idea of cultural heritage. In all reality, almost all Asian martial arts that people practice today are the product of the modern world. I mean, usually really surprisingly modern when you get right down to it. And yet, they are always associated with critical discourses of identity and history and community violence. Now, must you study the martial arts if you're interested in these questions? There are certainly other organizations and other institutions I can point to in southern China that have some of these same traits. You know, for instance, I actually began my research on community organization and violence in China a long time before I began to personally practice Kung Fu or I became academically interested in Kung Fu, right? Initially, I was conducting research on new religious movements and their association with violent uprisings during the late Qing dynasty. And I was doing this in an attempt to test a general theory of the relationship between social capital formation and ways of deterring violent conflict. I was giving a paper in 2009 at the Midwest Political Science Association meetings on the Boxer Rebellion, on this, question of social capital. And one of the commentators who was talking to me after my panel suggested that I go and take a look at things that had happened in southern China. Of course, he was trying to direct my attention to the Taiping Rebellion. And as I went and I looked at the Taiping Rebellion, one of the things that struck me was that there were all of these martial arts schools today, a lot of them involved with, the Choi Li Foot style, that have very strong social memories of the Taiping Rebellion. Now, whether those memories are real or imagined memories is a different question. But what's fascinating is at different points of historical crisis in their existence, they have looked back to these stories of the Taiping Rebellion. And at that point, I became very interested in the development of southern China's martial arts societies. Sure, there are other types of organizations like trade guilds or clan associations or new religious movements that occasionally become involved with community violence. Yet martial arts societies often view themselves as specialists in this realm. While the trade guilds of Tianjin or the Yihe boxers of Shandong have ceased to exist, those martial arts groups from southern China are still very much with us today. And as a student of globalization, it is just fascinating for me to look at the degree of success that they have had of insinuating themselves into the global environment. So shortly after I came to these realizations, I began a personal study of Wing Chun with John Nielsen, who actually taught at the same university that I was employed at the time. And he was interested in some of these questions. He'd been planning a more limited historical study of his own, and as he and I started to go back and forth, we decided that we would do something a little bit bigger, a little bit more theoretical, a little bit more broadly based. And it should have been easy, right? Because, he's a direct student of Ip Ching. Ip Ching is one of Ip Man's surviving children. So if you think about that lineage genealogy, right there, we've got pretty direct access to, some good sources. We should be able to get good, solid material when we go to do interviews, when we think about writing Wing Chun. So that means we should go and write a book about Wing Chun, right? Well, no, not really. Actually, that's not what this means at all. Because again, you still have to think about your goals. You have to think about research design. Making a contribution to the social scientific literature requires more than just access to good data. It requires more than a really interesting story. Specifically, you got to have a theory. Right? And the theory needs to be significant. So we began our investigation with a simple premise. We proposed that increased instances of community instability would lead in time to the development of new martial arts organizations. So rather than the martial arts being just a way in which people learn self-defense skills, which is how we normally talk about them, we saw these organizations as expressions of a community's self-interest. And they would be tolerated by community elites who would otherwise be worried about their, kind of rebellious potential. You got to be careful training young men to do violent things, okay? They would be tolerated only to the extent that they provided a degree of stability in the community. In short, while martial artists, especially when you look at their legends and stories about themselves, while martial artists always, pose as outsiders, right? They pose as individuals who can flaunt social convention. In reality, when you look at the sorts of roles that they play in Chinese communities, what you discover is that they're often playing a very conservative, almost reactionary role within Chinese social structure, right? Further, the impulse to create and fund such groups, we decided, was basically rational in nature, meaning it's going to vary by the level of demand. When instability is going up, when the demand will go up, we'll see more of these groups. And that's actually counter to the way that we have often thought about the Chinese martial arts, which is that this is an inherently cultural practice. Right? It's an expression of some ineffable something in Chinese culture. And if that's what it is, then there's no reason to expect that the number of martial arts societies you see will vary in time. As a matter of fact, we expect that in times of peace and stability, you'll see less martial arts activity. But a cultural theory might say, no, you'll see more. Right? Because now you have all these extra resources that you can be putting into non-essential, enjoyment-based activities like the martial arts, right? In order to test this theory, we had to develop a few hypotheses, and I put them up there, all right? So one of my hypotheses, being that I had this background in international relations and political science, focused on globalization. That's a question I'm very interested in. I'm not saying, by the way, that globalization is solely responsible for the development of the Chinese martial arts, rather that you can use globalization, as a hypothesis to test that theory. What does globalization do? Well, in the 19th century, China was forced to open its borders to trade on a previously unprecedented scale. As huge amounts of goods flowed into the country and flowed out of the country, what happened was you created new classes of winners and losers within Chinese society. A few individuals became fantastically wealthy off of this trade that was happening with the West. Many, many more people were left impoverished. They were trapped in declining forms of agriculture or declining types of handicraft. What we know from political economy is that that sort of increasing inequality in society always leads to social instability. And that social instability can escalate into violence, the kind of violence that would make you interested in starting a martial arts club, fairly easily if it's not managed. When viewed in this context now, suddenly Wing Chun is not just a personal interest and a good story or a good source of data. Now it begins to look theoretically interesting to us, because this is a practice which developed in the Pearl River Delta region. What do we find there? Well, we've got Guangzhou or Canton, we have Hong Kong, we have Foshan. These are the three largest, most economically productive cities in all of southern China, right? And this is the area of China that is first exposed to the shock of globalization and gets the hardest dose of globalization. And this is exactly the same environment and the same time at which Wing Chun comes into being. So suddenly, this all begins to look very theoretically interesting. Now, as John Nielsen and I discussed possible research and writing strategies, we realized that in addition to kind of opening this window onto the lives of ordinary Chinese citizens, we wanted to be able to test a lot of different theories with this. So we were looking to produce a data source that both we and then other social scientists could come along and they could use. And that was necessary because there are not that many books about the Chinese martial arts out there. And most of the books that we do have are talking about arts from northern China, and they have often extrapolated their findings, we thought incorrectly, to be global, to be talking about Chinese martial arts everywhere and every point in time. So the nature of the existing literature really helped us to kind of craft and decide what we wanted to do. Further, looking at Wing Chun was nice because it helped us, well, what we were able to do when we were looking at Wing Chun was we were able to kind of shift our focus from just one single individual style to say, no, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Pearl River Delta region as a whole. Wing Chun will remain our major case study, but this will allow us to start to bring in all of these other arts and practices that we see in this area. Okay, so we'll talk about Choi Li Foot, we'll talk about the Jingwu Association, we'll talk about Southern Mantis, or we'll talk about White Eyebrow, right? And as we begin to talk about all of these other arts, we multiply our observations. And we put ourselves in a situation where we're now not going to be testing our theory just on Wing Chun, which we already knew. And the danger, of course, there is that we will write a theory that fits the data. We will create a perfect tautology. Right? There's no way we can be wrong. But when we look at a region instead, and we bring in all of these other arts, now you have the actual possibility of challenging your own theory. You kind of escape that trap of tautology. You escape some of the issues of selection bias that often really plague books like this. You know, that this is a real issue you have to think about in the construction of an extensive single case. Inevitably, a lot of what we found had to be left out of this manuscript. You know, with as much room as we dedicated to Wing Chun, we weren't able to go much beyond the Ip Man lineage. And likewise, other arts, like Hung Ga deserved a lot more space in this book than we could dedicate to it. You know, it's just such a rich environment, there's no way you can include everything. But our hope was that by providing a history of a region, students of these other arts, students of these other lineages would be able to pick up our book and they would be able to read about the factors that were impacting their own practices, and they could kind of explore that on their own. And this brings us back to the question posed by those two stories that I read you at the very beginning of the paper. Right? If we focus only on the technical history of the Chinese martial arts, you know, what year was the first Bong Sao ever done? If that's what we're trying to do, we're going to be disappointed, right? The historical record is always too thin. It is too fragmentary for those kinds of discussions. And as Foucault reminds us, a high degree of caution and introspection is necessary whenever scholars find themselves seeking out, rather than seeking to question, the origin of some revered practice, right? Martial arts studies must never allow it to become a form of apologetics. This would become a very dangerous exercise if what we were to do were to become apologetics. But if instead we're interested in the history of a community and how the martial arts illuminate that community, that can be very helpful. Nor is the question of ultimate origins, I think, of much interest to anyone outside of the narrow area of martial arts studies. The most interesting question, again, isn't, did Ning Moy really invent Wing Chun? It's why did a group of teenagers in Hong Kong, or in this case Macau, in the 1960s, why did they care so much about this story, right? And are any of you teenagers from Macau in the 1960s? No, right? So why do we still care so much about this story, right? What is it about this story that still manages to grip and manages to cause such imagination, okay? That is an interesting question. Finally, why should the general reader care about the social history of the Asian martial arts? I think it may be cliché to say this, but explorations of history are rarely concerned only with the past. Ideally, such works should speak to our concerns in the present. I second D.S. Farr's call made at the first martial arts studies meetings that we held at the University of Cardiff. To grow, our field must tackle socially relevant questions, and we must present actual solutions. Wing Chun and the other Chinese martial arts are fascinating because they speak to so many very relevant questions. Right now, there's more interest than ever in the nature and origin of regional and national identity in China, right? This is particularly relevant with regard to Wing Chun as it's strongly associated with the South, with Hong Kong. And we're seeing in Hong Kong the growth of an increasingly independent and feisty identity, where people in Hong Kong are kind of carving out a separate identity for themselves than for the rest of China. Yet, when we move beyond such geographically focused concerns, do these systems, many of which were tied to specific moments in the 20th century, still have something to teach us today? And I'd like to argue that they do. And this lesson comes in the form of both a warning to us and an opportunity. All right? Nothing demonstrates the continued relevance of the Asian martial arts in Western society, and the Chinese martial arts in particular, than just flipping on your television set. Right? The Asian martial arts have become an accepted aspect of film, television programming, even major sporting events. They're dramatized in novels and comic books. We have an entire subsection of the internet that has nothing except funny martial arts videos, which is now probably even a bigger genre than instructional martial arts videos on the internet. Indeed, I expect most of us got our first exposure to the Asian martial arts through some kind of media exposure. And we think that that's a very new, modern, postmodern thing. It's not. If you go back to southern China in the 19th century, guess what? They all learned about the martial arts the same way. They all turned to the media, right? The media sources that they were looking at were things like Cantonese opera and marketplace performers. There are at least half a dozen different genres of professional storytellers that specialized in martial arts stories. There were serialized newspaper accounts. There were collectible cigarette cards that were all kung fu themed in southern China. There were radio broadcasts, radio dramas, later on, of course, films. It was through these routes that all focused on the martial arts, representations of the martial arts for entertainment's sake, that most people in southern China first got interested in the martial arts pretty much exactly like we do now today. And so when you want to know what kind of social work do the martial arts really do in society, you have to pay attention to these mediatized images, these economic markets, and these sorts of social discourses. First impressions, as we all know, are very powerful things. Consider the way the Chinese martial arts are portrayed in current film. Audiences seem to be attracted to the unapologetic violence that we see in a lot of these films. The fight choreography of Zhu Haofeng's recent film, The Master, in 2015, I think will appeal to a lot of modern Wing Chun students because we see this, I would say, kind of excessive use of butterfly swords in that film. You know, of course, that's our signature weapon. It's kind of an obscure weapon, so it's nice to see dozens and dozens of people killed with butterfly swords. Or we have Donnie Yen's now iconic 2008 dojo fight scene in Ip Man, in which he kind of brutally puts down an entire room full of karate students in a way that's kind of shocking, actually, from a kung fu film perspective. You don't normally see that level of violence in a typical kung fu film. At times, all of this reminds me of the bride's blade work, you know, minus the copious blood in Quentin Tarantino's 2003 homage to the kung fu genre, you know, Kill Bill. Nor are these the only places in the current media landscape where viewers find these sorts of images. Scenes of unskilled, nameless, unthinking attackers being cut down by the dozen bring to mind the exaggerated action and martial arts stylings of things like the Resident Evil franchise, or maybe the grittier violence that you see in the Walking Dead series. I suspect that on some level there is a shared language of violence between these two genres, between the kung fu film and the zombie thriller. And what I mean by that is in both cases, we see these spectacular portrayals of violence placed at the service of what one might call a world creation exercise. These images of violence are used to underscore the break with conventional social rules that govern all of our mundane lives, right? Thus, they're a primary aspect of this storytelling. They're not just a rhetorical or a stylistic flourish. The martial arts epic and the post-apocalyptic zombie adventure both offer us a world that does away with the decadent and comfortable conventions of our current environment, right? They offer us a stage on which only the awesome will survive. And who are these awesome heroes? Well, among their ranks, we find the awesomely strong, the skilled, the cagey, and sometimes the evil, because it seems that every new world demands a new villain. In short, the subtext of many of these stories seems to be that those who will survive and thrive in this new realm are individuals who are like us, because they embody all of the characteristics that we most like to imagine that we all have, right? Of course, this is who I am, right? There's an unmistakable air of wish fulfillment that goes on in these secondary creations. As we watch our heroes fight their way across an exotic landscape of a fantasy oriental past or a post-apocalyptic future, they embody and they project back to us our love of masculinity, of rugged independence, of stoic resilience, right? Perhaps we should not be surprised that the sense of looming social and economic crisis that has helped to popularize such stories over the last few decades is also thought to have contributed to the rise of various sorts of extremist movements around the globe. Rather than the inevitable triumph of globalization and liberal democracy that was envisioned at the end of the Cold War, we are seeing the rise of violent and very media-savvy non-state actors, illiberal democracies, and both popular and rightist movements in a transnational context. Nor, as Jared Miracle reminds us in the conclusion of his recent study of the global spread of the Asian martial arts, should we forget that these political movements have sometimes in the past been associated with these very fighting systems, right? The ethno-nationalist turn in certain martial arts, pioneered in Japan and China during the first half of the 20th century, provided a specific mechanism by which the physical strength and questions of national heritage and masculinity behind these practices could be marshaled and put at the disposal of extremist political groups and even states, right? We would be unwise, I think, to ignore the fact that there is much in the popular culture of the martial arts today, in both the East and West, which continues to make them tempting targets for such appropriation. So now we have to ask, is this intrinsic to the nature of the Asian martial arts themselves? Or is this instead something that is epiphenomenal, something that is historically contingent? Is this a relic of the particular circumstances under which the Asian martial arts first achieved momentum as mass social movements earlier in the 20th century? I think that this is another area where a better understanding of the social history of the Southern Chinese martial arts might provide us with a model for thinking about our current situation. Consider again those two stories that I read you that introduced this paper, the myth of Yim Wing Chun and the fight at Ta Cheng Village. From the final decades of the 19th century to the current era, many of the reasons wuxia novels or swordsman novels, and actually other types of martial arts storytelling as well, have focused on the lives of the impossibly talented wandering heroes of this mythic realm that they refer to as the rivers and lakes, right? So the rivers and lakes is kind of like the mythic setting that all of these martial arts novels take place in. And the heroes of those realms are not unlike Ning Moy and her student Yim Wing Chun. This somewhat unsettling territory is imagined as kind of an alternative social dimension. It's always like just beyond the edge of your sight. It's just beyond the edge of your social experience. But like those stories that I read you, it too suffers from a lack of effective central government. The government cannot maintain order. And what government there is usually corrupt, is usually in the process of oppressing the people. And so the protagonists of these stories, who are always the inheritors of some fantastically ancient martial arts system, the protagonists of these stories are then forced with finding a way to solve their own pressing personal or community problems. And given that these are novels that feature a very colorful array of wandering monks and corrupt soldiers and hidden kung fu masters, their solutions to their problems usually involve an absolutely spectacular resort to arms, in which you will see people flying all over the place, okay? These stories actively sought to create a sense of nostalgia in their readers for a vision of China's past that never actually existed. Now, at first glance, we might think that this rough and tumble realm of the rivers and lakes seems to bear more than a passing resemblance to the ultra-violent fantasy worlds of Kill Bill or Resident Evil. It too seems to establish this hierarchy of awesomeness based on one's strength, on your fighting style, on your martial virtue. What use do wandering swordsmen have for the conventions of village life with its many restraints? Well, first impressions can be deceptive. While it's not always apparent, the wandering swordsmen of the rivers and lakes are actually very concerned with questions of community organization and social justice. Seems like odd things, but they are. Far from being only violent escapist fantasies, many of the most popular stories to emerge out of this genre were actually debates about, very easily identifiable political and social problems. Two scholars of the wuxia genre, John Hamm and Petrius Liu, have examined these stories from different perspectives. And Petrius Liu in particular has argued that, look, when you actually read them in the context in which they were originally intended, these are stories that are obsessed with questions of community and politics. Nor do they view traditional society as some kind of mediocre mass that the hero is trying to escape, which is, of course, the trope that lies behind all zombie movies, right? Where is mediocre society? Well, it's that zombie horde that is behind you, right? It's that thing that you are literally trying to escape. Rather than attempting to establish then hierarchies of social organization based exclusively on martial strength, the real controversies in these stories is how do we deal with the inheritance of the past, with, the totalitarianism of the Qing state, or the chaos of the warlord period, or the tears that the more recent communist era have given us. In short, it was internal imperialism and the teleology of Western models of modernization that were the problems that demanded a solution in the Kung Fu genre. By demonstrating that it was possible that society could address these serious, even existential concerns without recourse to a strong centralized state apparatus, these stories sought to argue quite self-consciously for a social model that was horizontal in its organization, drawing strength from what Western scholars today would call civil society. These authors advanced a model that placed authority in the hands of local communities rather than in an externally imposed hierarchy coming from a distant center. While we tend to imagine these stories and even the creation myths of the various Chinese martial arts as reflecting, ancient or somehow traditional Chinese values, that's not really the case. Again, it's no coincidence that the great legends of this genre, guys like Shang Kai-ren or Jin Yang, wrote in moments of modern social and political upheaval. All of these stories, like the martial arts of southern China themselves, emerged from a period when the character of modern China was being actively debated by people. It was being actively debated in the press. During this period, the traditional martial arts offered a specific vision of the future by talking about an idealized past. Within it, the holistic nature of Chinese culture need not give way to the teleological dreams imported from the West. As Lou observed, and John Nielsen and I sought to document when we were looking at the practice and the organization of actual social systems, what they were looking for, what the martial arts were attempting to do in this Republic period was to put forward a model of social organization that was structured around the idea of min-jian, or between people, as opposed to that more universal, state-focused, always state-dominated idea of tian sha, or all under heaven. Liu suggested that this was precisely why the May 4th intellectuals came down so hard on the wuxia novels. It wasn't that they were actually feudal, right? It's that they offered an alternate view of what society could be, of what Chinese modernity could be, in which you did not need these highly centralized models that had been imported from the West. And again, you see exactly the same thing in the actual practice. And so for some intellectuals that were invested in those models, that was a very threatening thing. The social history, then, of the Chinese martial arts matters because they reveal moments when these institutions, practices, and reformers stood at crossroads. A close examination of any of the Asian martial arts show that they never existed in a vacuum, nor have they ever been motivated by a timeless and inscrutable logic of their own. Our account of Wing Chun demonstrates that the region, southern China's martial arts, have always functioned in conjunction with other social, economic, political, and even aesthetic impulses. For instance, as we delved into our book, we discovered it was impossible to tell the story of Wing Chun or the Southern martial arts without looking really closely at the struggles of organized labor in the 1920s and 30s and what was a very radicalized class system at that point in time. Right? In China, but also in other places in Asia, individuals have become involved in the martial arts precisely because they have sought a voice in these kinds of disputes about what their communities are going to be. As we review these debates, or as we examine the lives of individuals like Ip Man, we're reminded that many aspects of these practices and the traditions even that seem to underpin them are in reality radically historically contingent. The traditional martial arts could have evolved in many different ways over the course of the 20th century. And when we discover that, what we find is that modern martial artists can't just follow tradition. They also have choices to make. They must choose, just as their predecessors did, where to innovate and where to adhere to tradition when they teach. But likewise, they must choose, as their predecessors did, in social and political discussions, how they are going to present and position their practices. What sorts of values will the modern martial arts advance? Will they be governed by the principle of minjia, between people, attempting to reach out horizontally to create broad-based coalitions of cooperation within civil society? Or will the martial arts once again put their resources at the disposal of those seeking to rebuild the hierarchies of awesomeness by supporting violent, illiberal, or simply exclusionary ethno-nationalist ideals? I don't pretend that a study of the past offers definitive guidance in the present. But as we read about those actions of people like Ip Man, of people who came before us, we're reminded that the choices that we make now in our practice, our personal practice in the martial arts, are going to have consequences. Likewise, the way in which we scholars choose to write about the martial arts is also going to have consequences. It will have important implication for our understandings, not just of these practices, but also of ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben, for the talk. And I think we have a couple of minutes, and it's up for discussion. I think some of our beliefs in lockdown are worth it to discuss.
Well, thank you, Ben, for this wonderful demonstration of what historians call the invention of tradition. You know, that was a real great demonstration of how that works. And if you study invention of traditions, you know that to some extent they're open to hybridity. So my first question would be, what is the role of hybridity in the story that you were trying to tell? The other remark, or it's also a question, goes to reflects on the status of photography or the sources that you presented. I'm a historian of photography as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know that some of these photos must have been staged.
Yes.
These are not actual photos taken in the moment, in the heat of the moment, or in the display of Wing Chun. These are staged photographies, if I understand the dates when they're produced correctly. So I also would ask you about the role of photography as a media to invent a tradition, to portray and convey this tradition.
Well, I'm going to start with the photography because I think that's actually the more interesting of the two questions. They're both interesting questions, but that's the one I'm deeply engaged with. So I kind of got into the habit of collecting vintage postcards and photographs of the Chinese and also the Japanese martial arts. And it's very rewarding, and it's kind of frustrating because there are not that many of them. There are lots of vintage images of Japanese martial arts because of its social status, but the Chinese martial arts that did not have that same status were not photographed as much. It's really hard to find those images. So I'm quite happy to do presentations like this where I can actually put some of them up here. And yeah, you're right, when you look at a lot of these photographs, I mean, by definition, they're all staged, right? They hadn't invented street photography yet. No one was doing street photography at this point in time. And when I go back and I look at a photo from the 1870s or 1880s, I mean, not only is it staged, It happened in a photography studio, and the guy couldn't move, and we've got like he's braced up behind him to hold him in place for long enough for the aperture to capture that image. And I think it's why the photography is so important, because it doesn't convey ethnographic information about the practice of the martial arts so much as it conveys ethnographic information about the understanding, the social understanding of the martial art, right? So you get this complex conversation sometimes between the martial artists who are posing, right? If I go all the way back to, unfortunately, I'm going to scroll back to one of the first photos I put up here. Yeah, this one here.
Exactly. That's
right.
The one that struck me.
Right.
This is impossible.
Right. Well, this is a dialogue, right? So what is this supposed to be on the surface? This is supposed to be a marketplace performance of the type that was very, very common. You would see marketplace performances. You'd see guys going out there. But wait a second. The audience forms a ring around the performer. The photographer is standing in the middle of the ring, which means it's not a real performance. Because, that guy would like cut him up, right? And so the entire thing is a staged event.
And you have available light. There's no flash.
Right.
The light is coming from the right. You can see the long shadows. So he had to remain like this for quite a while in order to be taken,
Right. And so then what becomes really interesting is the fact that, you've got a negotiation going on between how does he, a professional martial artist, how is he going to portray his practice, and then how is the photographer going to capture and market and promote that practice, right? And then you can see, because this is a postcard that was actually sent, how it was actually discussed, right? So, this is a really old postcard, so the back they didn't write on the back, it was all addressed. So on the front the note is, look, this is a very nice site, right? So we see this now three-way complex conversation. We've got a martial artist, we've got a photographer, and then we have a consumer who buys this in the moment, and it reflects that consumer's view of what China is doing. And that consumer sends it to someone else, right?
And postcards are the leading media between roughly 1880 and 1920.
Yeah.
There are studies about postcards that were actually sent like this.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out there are billions of postcards like this that were sent around the world. It is the one, before the invention of the radio, this is the most important media you have.
Right, and this is one of the reasons why I collect postcards, because we talk about the Chinese martial arts in the West, and Paul's going to have to forgive me for this, as though they emerged spontaneously from Bruce Lee's brain, right? That, there was nothing, and then Bruce Lee shows up, and bam, there's Chinese martial arts everywhere. And I agree that when Bruce Lee shows up, something changes. But I think part of that change that we have to acknowledge is a lot of this stuff gets forgotten. In order for Bruce Lee to be new and exciting and innovating, a lot of what had been Chinese boxing in popular culture, all of these postcards that are getting sent back and forth, right? All of the Yellow Peril novels that come out in the wake of the Boxer Rebellion, right? All of the newspaper articles about hatchetmen in San Francisco, they all somehow get forgotten, right? So yeah, I love this because it shows what a social discourse is at a moment in time, but it also shows how ephemeral that social discourse is. This was really important in the 1920s, or 1910s, the 1920s, and then it had no afterlife, right? It was literally ephemera. It is literally forgotten. I don't know. Is that enough on the photography?
Okay, thank you. Further questions?
Micro or no?
Micro.
Okay.
Thank you for the great analysis. I have one observation. There's a great similarity between those role of martial arts in society and the role of theology in society. especially political theology. Every time when you can observe any kind of crisis, the theology, the different kinds of belief rises and goes up with the strangest kinds, and for every flavor and every people different of different needs. And I'm curious how those two, how martial arts with its own part on spiritual acceptance or claim correlates with the theological parts. And I think a great example, the best example we know for the political theology rising is the siege of Constantinople. It's very well written down and documented, so we can study it very good. And I'm curious if there are any kind of similar observations to the martial arts. And I'd like to follow this thought and these questions.
It's probably not a coincidence that a lot of my work in the history of the Chinese martial arts has echoed things that have happened in the literature on the study of religion and the sociology of religion, because that was the area that I was working in immediately before I started the martial arts project, right? So specifically, I was looking at questions of theology and religion and community organization and how you deal with violence, and that kind of led me into the martial arts. And so it may not totally be a coincidence, you know, that there are a lot of echoes here, even ones that I have not thought about. I would say, to begin with, the first thing you need to do when we address this question is we have to expand it directly beyond immediate discussions of spirituality in the martial arts to include nationalism, right? You know the joke that, right, you know, religion is a 16th century word for the nation. Religion is a 16th century word for the nation, right? So, you know, they didn't have the nation yet. But I think that is really true, especially when we start to look at modern China, that the nation becomes, you know, a saving theological argument almost. You know, national arguments are religious arguments in a way in China. Now, that's very important when we look at the martial arts, because not all martial artists have a spiritual element to their practice. And specifically with the Chinese martial arts, this is really deeply, violently, loudly contested between different martial artists. So what we see on the one hand is a group of martial artists who want these practices to be modern and nationally focused. And like the Jingwu Association goes so far even as to say that the goal of the martial arts is national salvation, right? And national salvation then leads to the betterment of all of the individual people. And opposing that, you have more traditional groups that, I don't want to say they're finding older forms of Chinese spirituality. What they're doing is they're inventing new forms of old Chinese spirituality, and they're bringing it in. So this might be where we get into some of that hybridity that we were just talking about. You see lots of this sort of thing, but it's not any one discourse. It's like there are 2 or 3 different contending discourses, and people are fighting with each other about, you know, which one do we put first, right? Do we subordinate all of this to this new religion of the state, or do we instead look to the past and, you know, we go in this way where we're going to resurrect Taoism, or, you know, reimagine Taoism as something that had never been through the martial arts?
Yeah, thank you. Another thought is if you transfer that kind of tools to analyze martial arts, I think you can read Krav Maga as a kind of response to the permanent crisis in the East, and the part of intelligence in Krav Maga as a kind of modern or postmodern spirituality. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Wer war zuerst?
You said maybe the sources are too thin, but I'm still interested in the Bongzhou. And,
yeah.
But in relation to what you said, because in your talk and also in your book, you very convincingly showed how what we assume to be traditional Chinese martial arts were formed exactly, or at least the southern styles, were formed in this period under these social circumstances. And for the social institution of the martial arts, yes, this is clear now. But in how far does the physical, the bodily activity themselves, the movements, the forms, does it also reflect these developments? Like, were forms changed? Were movements invented to, I don't know, construct a narrative about how the body should be now in this new circumstance? So things like this. Is there a link, one that we can still trace back?
That is a very difficult question, right? Because it's a very difficult question because we don't have a lot of deep, rich imagery for what the traditional martial arts are until this photography that we were just discussing shows up, right? And even then, those are just still images, right? So martial artists have lots and lots of stories about, this is how we did it during the Ming Dynasty. And I don't think you can believe any of them, right? In terms of the history of what we know about boxing in southern China, it's really only at the end of the Ming Dynasty that boxing styles themselves that are identifiably different from wrestling, right, that have names and teachers begin to appear. And by the end of the Ming Dynasty, we have sources that can name in Guangdong province maybe a dozen different martial arts boxing styles that are being done. And then the Qing cataclysm happens, right, and this is a big break in the social history of southern China. That was a traumatic event. And it was traumatic enough that apparently none of these boxing styles survived. And by the early Qing dynasty, we don't hear a lot about boxing being done. There are really only a couple sources. And then as boxing begins to be reestablished, what we get is different sorts of institutions, right? And they have different sorts of names. Suddenly, a lot of the names that we see associated with boxing are family names all of a sudden. And that kind of makes sense. Because when you think about these clan structures I was talking about, again, the Chinese say that the clans go back forever, right? You know, my clan goes back to the Song dynasty. And it's not true, right? The only people who had, clan-based temple worship at the end of the Ming Dynasty were just a handful of very, very elite administrators who had come from, the capital, right? The idea of organizing yourself into a clan really starts in the middle of the Qing Dynasty in Guangdong, right? And that's kind of at the same time we see the martial arts coming in. So now all these new martial arts have family names. Right? That's pretty significant. So I can say definitively some stuff about social organization, right? Just from what I know. What can I say about the development of technique? Well, it's almost impossible because I don't have any specific sources relating to me what, long pole technique had been in southern China, during the Ming Dynasty. I'm not satisfied with this. I'm not happy, right? As a practitioner, I am constantly doing things like I look at my 6.5-point pole form in Wing Chun, and I look at Yu Dai Yu's pole form, in his Ming Dynasty manual, and it's like, oh yeah, what I'm doing, that's a lot, So probably that kind of pole work has its basis in the Ming piracy crisis. And that's probably the oldest, most archaic part of the Wing Chun system. And it's really interesting that that's still there. But as a historian, do I have, enough sources where I could, no, I can't, right? That's all kind of, my experience and kind of intersubjective judgment. I just don't have enough sources about what things actually looked like in the Ming Dynasty to say, this is what it actually looked like then. And it's not that lots of Chinese people don't want to tell me the answer. They do. They all have answers. They all want to tell me. None of it's reliable.
Okay. All right, thank you. I thought that was fantastic. And I really want to ask you about a range of questions inspired by a scene in one of the Herman Yao Ip Man films. And it's the scene where Ip Man kind of saves his students on the street, and he has a fight. And
this is the final fight.
Is that the one? Yeah. And the journalist sees the fight, and and it's a really, I can't even remember which film it's in, but it's such a striking scene. It's about the only thing I take away from all of the Ip Man films. It's the journalist sees him fighting and goes, "This is a fantastic story," and he mythologizes Ip Man. So, and it's an animated sequence in the film, and so the film is really very self-aware of the process of the mythologization of Ip Man. So it's a film that's about that. It's a film that mythologizes Ip Man, but also tries to kind of demythologize. Yeah. So I wanted
to demythologizes the mythologizing of Ip Man.
It demythologized the mythologizing process, and then it made me think about the stories that you began with, and then the discussion you've just had about photography. And it seems like you have also a theory, at least implicitly there, of not just representation, but of documentation. And I wonder if you have an explicitly thought through theory about the documenting of, because it strikes me that the examples you've chosen, Ip Man's writing about the creation myth and the newspaper story, you're saying they're both doing different kinds of work. These are both kinds of documentation. I mean, perhaps, Ip Man, but it's always doing a different kind of work. So then you get, and this is a long question, and I apologize. The thing that I also know about the Herman Yao film is that Herman Yao, when he made that film, was a PhD student of Megan Morris in Hong Kong. And Megan Morris's work on film is always about film as self-reflexive on film. So it's a very, very self-aware and complex process of representation and documenting. And I'm wondering if, to what extent you've worked on these ideas, you know, the postcards, the newspaper articles, the personal notes. Is there a theory there? Have you got one or several?
I pointed to... oh, man. I pointed to that book, Weapons of the Weak, right? And I think that is a good place to start thinking about the political use of storytelling. And so James C. Scott would kind of be the beginning of my theory about that. Now, the thing is, there are these emic and etic stories, right? There are multiple discourses. There is an internal discourse within the world of the Chinese martial arts, and then there's a discourse between the world of the Chinese martial arts and the outside world, and those two discourses touch on each other sometimes, and other times they don't, right? And so it's not all one set of political arguments. It's way more complex than that. But yeah. These are all motivated representations, right? This is what I was saying. Every account that we have comes from someone's hands. They were all written down for a reason, right? And it's generally that you're either trying to make an argument about where you sit in the world of the martial arts or where the martial arts sit in the world of Chinese society. One of the things I think is really interesting about that, the final fight, about that scene that you were looking at, is the Wing Chun community is very aware of that particular episode. That's why it's in the film, this is one of those few touchstones of Ip Man's life that everybody knows about. Everybody knows that one of the ways that he got to be prominent in Hong Kong was local newspaper writers started to write about him, right? And so even when we talk about that, that's part of, our representation of it. It's, oh look, Ip Man is the kind of guy who's so important that he's like Wong Fei Hung. Local martial artists are, local newspaper writers are going to be writing about him in here. So I don't know what to say. Look, I'm a political scientist. I believe inherently everything is political, and I believe everybody's trying to get it over on the next guy. Maybe that's where you and I would differ on this a little bit, in that when you talk about discourses, you see discourses kind of as free-floating, in society, that, they don't necessarily have a logic, a political logic of creation, even if they have, is that correct? Even if they have political consequences?
No, I think I'm closer to your position, actually.
You're closer to my definition.
Maybe I emphasized different things.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm looking at this and I'm saying, no, look, there, on the big level, there is a fight going on about what Chinese modernity is supposed to be. People are consciously crafting stories to create the expectation of norms about this is what, you know, the good Chinese life looks like in exactly the way James C. Scott is talking about with Indonesian peasants, right? Then within the Chinese martial arts, we get a parallel process going on in which we talk about, okay, this is why you should do Wing Chun and not Choi Foot, right? And if you want the best example of that, you look at, like, you know, the rules of the Choi Foot school, and you look at the rules of the Ip Man school, and you're like, oh my God, Ip Man took the Choi Foot rules, and then he changed them to make an argument about, like, you know, why the way we interact with society is better than the way those Choi Foot guys interact with society, right? You know, so it's just motivated all the way down. Does that answer your question?